Well, hello there, and welcome to day 141 of A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And, as you'd expect, we have reached the second culmination of the MCU. We have finally reached Avengers Age of Ultron. Unfortunately, this is going to be one of those deconstruction videos because unfortunately this is now the third case of four where it's worth looking at a sequel to a successful MCU film and how it couldn't quite manage to capture the same ability and structure and discipline of its predecessor. Because Age of Ultron doesn't entirely work as a film. It actually holds together okay, and it's fun to watch as part of the grand MCU TV series that the movies make up. But as a film, structurally, it has a lot of problems, and unfortunately that has a knock-on effect in every aspect of it. A lot of the issues with it do relate to the same things that I said about Iron Man 3, and the same things I said about Thor the Dark World, which is I suppose it's over-ambition in terms of trying to find a way to escalate beyond the rather simple structure of the original, whilst also retaining the cast members who were from the first film and expanding them, and then also trying to, escalate and build upon what came in the first film. And frankly, what it boils down to is that it's just too much for one film to cope with. So I suppose I'll need to talk a bit about Joss Whedon. My thoughts and feelings on Joss Whedon and the current revelations and discussion around his workplaces has been discussed endlessly in previous videos with films that he has worked on. So I'm going to refer back to those. I'm just going to talk about him as a filmmaker in this regard. And I'm very well aware of the fact that, it's a public record that Joss Whedon had a very difficult time with this film. After the success of the original Avengers film, he was essentially given the keys. They wanted him to be what I suppose now Kevin Feige is, which is to be an overseer who managed the all of the films within the MCU, whilst building towards the big, get-togethers that are say the Avengers films. But he didn't want to do that. He is ostensibly a filmmaker, and I think the impression is he just wanted to make one film at a time, rather than essentially being a producer, executive producer over an entire franchise. But he was contracted for this one, and so he came in with the same sort of ambition as he did with the original, with the same style. Unfortunately, I do think this got on top of him, that it was too much. The executive meddling, the stress of having to manage so many main characters, and pick up all the storylines that had evolved between the two Avengers films and set up the future storylines going forward. It completely overshadows the ability to be able to tell a singular story. Now, I personally defended Age of Ultron for a long, long time after it came out, and I was in the camp of people who said, okay, it's not perfect, but James Spader is genuinely phenomenal as Ultron. It's great to see these characters again. It doesn't lose anything just because the essence of it is still there. There are some really cool set pieces. All these things were arguments I would make. And I remember reading at the time the case that, you have your more serious character films with individual, Thor films or Iron Man films or Captain America films, but the Avengers is supposed to be your fun, blockbuster, popcorn movie. It's supposed to be everyone gets together and they fight a villain, but there's no depth to it. Now, what we've learned in subsequent Avengers films is that's palpably untrue. That actually, the Avengers films allows you to bring together these characters who have such rich and vibrant personalities and backstories that are continually evolving outside of the films, and bring them together to enhance their relationships. Unfortunately, this film attempts to do that, but again, people said, that it was quite clear that it was failed to do that, and so consequently, that was sort of the compromise, that the argument that was being made, saying, well, it's just a popcorn film, it doesn't matter that it doesn't have depth. That's not to say it's not there. I suppose my sort of thing I noted from the beginning of the film, watching it, is the fact that it has really strange pacing and tonal issues. I don't particularly think the opening is very strong, because it does open in an action set piece, and that's an interesting way to open the film. But I'd say everything up to the party scene is a little lifeless, and everyone just feels that little bit flat, and almost subdued. You just notice in the performances there are just moments where it almost feels like, and it almost is the key word, is it almost feels like a lot of the actors are going through the motions. They know their characters that they've established. They know the dynamics. They know the beats of what leads up to a punchline, or what leads up to a cool action moment. And for a little bit, it actually does feel like they're like, okay, yes, tab A into slot B, continue. And I guess maybe that's sort of on a subtext level. Maybe that's the point, is that the Avengers are reaching that point where they know how to beat their villain. They're just rattling on. Their team works together. There's no issues with it. And then the Ultron stuff kicks in. Now, what I've realised on this watch through, which I think every time I watch it anew I forget and remember as I'm watching, which is, this is of course another film which, like Guardians of the Galaxy, to some degree like the original Avengers film, is obviously trying to focus around one of the Infinity Stones and make that the central piece, the MacGuffin that the whole film is essentially built around. But because it's so focused on Ultron, the Mind Stone's kind of forgotten and then remembered and then forgotten. Because if it is sort of the core of the film, it does feel like it does feel a bit like they collect it, then it gets taken, then they collect it again, and then certain character has it or another character has it, and then it ends up in the head of Vision. But it's actually kind of vital, because it's through the Mind Stone that the Maximoffs are created. It's through the Mind Stone that Ultron's created. There's an implication that Thanos has access to the power within the Mind Stone to some degree, and that ultimately he was the progenitor of Ultron and everything that happens. Hence the after credit scene where he says, "Oh, I'll do it myself," implying, that on some level he set these things in motion. But the Mind Stone, and so you should have opened, like with the original, where the original talks, you have that prologue. Really, the Mind Stone should have had a central prologue moment. And I know they were trying to do that with Tony Stark and the Vision, and the fact that he has this horrifying vision, and that's what propels him to want to build the armor that leads to Ultron, etc., etc. But frankly, that should have been, I don't know, you watch it and it's just part of the action that's at the beginning, and it doesn't quite work. It doesn't feel like it's given the magnitude of horror that that the film later establishes it as being. That this is the thing that Tony is constantly thinking about and grappling with all of his decision making. And it's things like that really sort of bring the film down, where you have things that are set up, you have things that are being established, but they're not. They don't lead to a peak within the narrative. You have things that sort of build and build, and then just, I don't know, the air is being let out the balloon, which feels damp at certain points. As I've said, one of the major positives is James Spader as Ultron. He is genuinely, I remember seeing that trailer and him singing the No Strings on Me song, and genuinely it was like, oh my god, this Ultron will be the great villain of the MCU that we haven't seen before. And he is, to some degree. I definitely think it's there in the performance. What I like about Ultron is that he isn't just a robot. He isn't just a villain. He actually has quite a lot of pathos and depth to him. The fact that he's not just driven by wanting to destroy, but also by sort of this subtextual anguish and agony that he goes through that's referenced a few times. And at moments you get that performance within the voice acting and CG, which is genuinely very cool. The idea that they managed to get so much through this CG rendering of a motionless machine, and yet you get that. And the thing that really unfortunately lets it down is the fact that you have the pathos, you have the anguish, you have the rage, you have the sinister quality, but then on top of that, they also decide to give him that sort of quippy, Whedon-esque style to him, that Tony Stark banter. And the reason for it makes sense, which is, whereas in the comics, Ultron is created by Hank Pym, and he's supposed to have some of Hank Pym's personality traits. To try and tie it into the MCU more immediately, they went, okay, it's going to be broadly based on Tony Stark's mind, and so Ultron will sort of, replicate Tony Stark in some ways. And I see the logic in that, but unfortunately, it does take away from the fact that there are moments when Ultron is genuinely terrifying and haunting, and you don't know if he's going to do something, he's going to be comforting or threatening. And everything is part of his ultimate plan to just destroy the world. And and you get those moments where, for instance, where the Maximoffs betray him and leave because they realise what he's going to do. And there's just that moment where you see him in pain, and it really shows this sort of increased intensity in a being who's already full of despair and anguish. So, I do wish the humoury bits, they don't have to entirely be gone, but they needed to be toned down, and just certain lines taken out to just retain that sense of threat and scale. I mean, the Maximoffs are really good, actually. Wanda and Pietro, both fully formed and rich characters who do have that sense of intention and horrifying backstory that ties in really well, and so that makes them really great sub-villains, and then obviously turned heroes. I mean, Elizabeth Olsen, I do think it's a shame they killed Aaron Taylor-Joy, but he does serve the function within the narrative, and it is an interesting twist, because you think it's going to be Barton who gets killed, and yet it's the new character they introduce, and he had enough of a personality that it actually mattered. Whereas Wanda, I mean, Wanda is someone who obviously we've seen go on to become this really interesting character. And even from here, you do get that again. Elizabeth Olsen is really giving such a great performance here as Wanda. Unfortunately, in subsequent films, the character does suffer from being neglected and underwritten, and that's a real issue. But she brings it back with, say, WandaVision really brings it back. But you can see it here as well. You really can. And of course, we're talking about Clint and the fact that his character, I mean, obviously, as someone who in the first film had a very background sub-villain role, the fact that in this film he essentially gets to be the most human character, and obviously he is, I suppose, to some degree, the most human character, normal human character, but the fact that, you know, they establish a family who didn't exist in the comics, it's just something that they just went, let's just add this to his story, really builds him up in a way that actually gives him a lot more, and obviously we'll see that develop in the later Avengers film, where we really see the stake and the consequences. And I think establishing a family for him really makes him stand out in his own right from some of the other characters. And again, he just is given so much to do. He's given some real. There's a certain way in the way they write, and of course, Jeremy Renner performs the character that really gives him a way to process the horror, you know, the horror around him. But yeah, I do wish some of the stuff with Ultron was more horror centric, and the visions, Wanda's visions that she shows everyone, which they lean towards a little. There's something supposed to be quite surrealist and haunting about it. But I wish that had been more consistent with the total tone of the film. That it had that sense of horror and haunting to it. And obviously as someone who loves the genre of horror, maybe that suggests that that's the reason I want that. But frankly, I just think that would have given it a slightly different tone. You could have still had the broad Avengers tone to it outside of those sequences, but with Ultron, with Wanda's visions, they needed to be genuinely disturbing, because that would actually have left an impact, you know, a more long lasting impact. And yeah, it's just weird pacing things that don't work. I was like the character of Helen Choi, who is fine as just a minor character who has a role in this, and her, you know, and is quite essential to the plot, and seemingly is supposed to be killed off, but then isn't killed off. And I understand that might have been a studio note or something, but again, that shows weird character weird character storytelling, where it's like, okay, so you essentially built up to this character dying, but without actually killing her. That's strange. Or Stellan Skarsgård, who gets brought in to essentially do nothing, to be there for someone for Thor to talk to in 2 scenes. I mean, that whole scene with the whirlpool, again, is an indication of something the studio wanted, because it was supposed to feed into Ragnarok, even though it doesn't really in the grand scheme of things, and doesn't really detracts from the narrative. And it's just stuff like that. It's just really strange editing and pacing issues where it just didn't need them. The film feels very disjointed. It is a jigsaw of some genuinely good bits. The Hulk Iron Man fight is genuinely great, and it's cool to see the Hulkbuster armor, and the fight actually has some intention and meaning behind it, and of course will play into later installments of the MCU. It becomes quite pivotal, and again it demonstrates the Hulk's or Bruce Banner's character and his relationship to the Hulk, and the rest of the world's relationship to the Hulk, and how that can switch on a dime, where it goes from he's a hero to, oh, he's a monster who needs to be destroyed or stopped. And again, I think that's a really good sequence to it. And it's stuff like that. And all the set pieces are pretty good. It's just I don't know. I don't know if the bits between them always worked. I don't know. Maybe there was one too many set pieces because there were two towards the end. There are essentially one set piece with a small break, and it's just stuff like that where it genuinely feels like it's become quite confused and doesn't quite know how to bring itself together in a coherent way. I mean, of the sequels, it is one of the stronger ones. It suffers from the Iron Man 2 problem of all those things with retaining characters and setting up future storylines and all the things I said earlier. But it probably does it better than Iron Man 2 did. I mean, like I said, it still has much more interesting villains and more of an arc to it. It's definitely better than Dark World, which is still the bottom of my current list based on the ones I've watched recently. It's not as good as Winter Soldier, but yeah, and it's a real concern, I suppose, going forward about the dangers of these sequels. I mean, we're about to hit that period where we're going to have more MCU sequels than new MCU films. I mean, of course, we've got this year's actually an exception, I suppose, because we've got Black Widow, Shang-Chi, and the Eternals, all first Marvel films coming up. But then beyond that, we have, of course, Guardians of the Galaxy 3, Captain Marvel 2, Black Panther 2, Thor 4. It just go Ant-Man 3. It's at that point now where, okay, as we go forward, maybe I'll look at some of the other sequels to some of the founding Avengers character or MCU character films and go, yep, they finally cracked the sequel. But based on this, it's still a sign that the sequels are very disjointed, and it does make me worry for what that means when we get to a point where we have almost exclusively sequels in the films. But hey, I still enjoyed this. I think you have to switch your brain off a bit, because otherwise the whole thing starts to fall apart. And I do think it's a shame that they that Ultron is gone from the whole series. I actually do. He is a villain who I would have loved to see return. I mean, lots of people are against the idea of MCU villains being killed off. I'm not too fussed on it a lot of the time because I think there's enough of a well of characters to introduce. But Ultron was such an interesting character, and he is someone who I would have happily seen in a future film. And hey, they might find ways around it, but for now, this is it. But anyway, yeah, it's okay. And unfortunately, it's a bit of a lukewarm cap to Phase 2. Although we do have, of course, the next MCU, the last in the Phase 2 MCU films coming up. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, please hit the like button, comment below, and subscribe to the channel because those all help me in the algorithm. Do check out my back catalogue of videos. Of course, the big MCU playlist as it grows and grows. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about movies, TV shows, and I share the YouTube uploads once they're ready. Thank you for joining me. Take care.